Peter Popoff was a man whose sermons reached millions of Americans, broadcast into living rooms every week with promises of healing, divine intervention, and life-changing blessings. On television screens, he appeared charismatic and commanding, a man whose booming voice carried authority, faith, and hope. Crowds at his live events swore they had witnessed miracles. Individuals across the nation sent him money with the belief that they were participating in God's work. To the faithful, Popoff was a conduit between heaven and earth, a man chosen to perform acts that defied logic and medicine alike. Born in West Germany in 1946 and immigrating to the United States as a child, Popoff grew up in a religious household, steeped in the language of revivalist preaching. From an early age, he displayed an uncanny ability to memorize scripture, deliver fervent sermons, and connect emotionally with audiences. He quickly rose through the ranks of evangelical circles, preaching at tent revivals and regional events, and by the late 1970s, he had become a fixture on Christian television. His ministry promised something few could resist: certainty, divine favor, and the possibility of miracles in a world full of suffering. Popoff's television broadcasts were designed to reach vast audiences. Viewers were encouraged to call in, send letters, and contribute financially to the ministry in exchange for blessings, prayer, or even the famous miracle water that promised healing. Those who participated often described personal experiences of faith and devotion, reinforcing Popoff's growing reputation. Donations poured in, often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per week, and the ministry expanded to a sprawling operation with offices, television studios, and thousands of supporters who believed in the power of the preacher's word. Yet behind the spectacle, a darker mechanism was at work. In 1986, investigative journalist and skeptic James Randi began examining Popoff's ministry and discovered evidence that would shock millions. While Popoff appeared to know intimate details about audience members' lives, illnesses, personal struggles, and family tragedies, he was not divinely informed. Hidden microphones and cue cards, delivered to him by his wife and staff off stage, supplied the exact information he used to astound congregants. What appeared to be miraculous knowledge was, in fact, an elaborate ruse. Popoff's seemingly supernatural insight was manufactured, meticulously planned, and entirely human in execution. The exposure was devastating. Randi, along with a team of investigators, recorded Popoff receiving instructions through an earpiece during live broadcasts, revealing the carefully orchestrated deception. In one notorious demonstration, Randi played the hidden recordings during a public segment, showing exactly how Popoff's responses to supposed divine revelations were fed to him in real time. The evidence was irrefutable. Millions had been misled, believing that miracles and divine messages were being delivered directly from God, when in reality they were carefully scripted and staged. The fallout was immediate. Television networks dropped Popoff's programs, and donations to his ministry plummeted. Congregants who had believed in his supernatural powers felt betrayed, their faith shaken by the realization that they had been manipulated for financial gain. Media coverage was relentless, detailing the mechanics of the deception and analyzing the psychological tactics used to convince viewers that Popoff possessed powers he did not. Critics described the ministry as a sophisticated confidence scheme, combining elements of faith, authority, and spectacle to extract trust and money from believers. Popoff initially denied wrongdoing, framing the controversy as an attack on his faith and a misunderstanding of his intentions. He claimed that his ministry had always been about inspiring hope and encouraging devotion. However, the recordings, corroborated eyewitness accounts, and financial records painted a starkly different picture. The manipulation was not an accident or a misjudgment. It was systematic, calculated, and designed to exploit the trust and spiritual longing of millions. Despite the scandal, Popoff would later attempt a comeback in the 1990s, rebranding his ministry and returning to television with a renewed emphasis on prosperity gospel teachings. While some former critics remained skeptical, others were drawn to the promise of healing and wealth, demonstrating the enduring allure of charismatic authority even in the wake of exposure. Scholars of religion and psychology have examined Popoff's methods as an example of how authority, showmanship, and faith can be exploited to manipulate behavior and extract resources from believers. Reflection. The story of Peter Popoff is a chilling reminder that trust can be weaponized in the guise of faith. Millions were convinced that divine insight and miraculous healing were being delivered through his words, yet every revelation had been fed to him by human collaborators. The allure of miracles, the power of charisma, and the desire for hope created a perfect environment for deception. It raises haunting questions about how easily belief can be manipulated and how vulnerable communities of faith can become when trust is absolute. In the end, Peter Popoff's story is not merely about one man's fraud. It is about the intersection of hope and deceit, the seduction of authority, and the fragility of belief in the face of calculated manipulation. For millions, the preacher who promised miracles became a symbol of betrayal, a lesson that even the most convincing voice from the pulpit can hide the most human of lies. Billy Sol Estes was a man who understood the allure of power, money, and charisma long before he entered the world of ministry. Born in 1925 in rural Texas, he came from modest beginnings but quickly demonstrated a keen intellect and an uncanny ability to persuade others. By the 1950s and 60s, he had built a reputation not just as a businessman, but as a man who could make the impossible seem real. A man whose vision promised wealth and prosperity to anyone willing to trust him. His skills in manipulation and showmanship would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures in American televangelism, blending the promise of divine blessing with a mastery of deception. Estes first rose to prominence through a combination of agricultural schemes and business ventures. He exploited loopholes in federal farm programs, convincing lenders and investors to back ventures that appeared legitimate but were built on fraudulent contracts and fabricated inventories. His charm, persuasive speech, and ability to present numbers in a convincing manner allowed him to pull off complex schemes that defrauded banks, government programs, and individual investors alike. Local communities marveled at his apparent success, unaware that the empire they admired was built on lies, misrepresentation, and cunning manipulation. By the late 1950s, Estes had intertwined his business acumen with religious messaging, presenting himself as a man blessed by God to prosper and, by extension, to bring blessings to those who followed him. He leveraged the growing reach of television to broadcast messages that promised wealth, success, and divine favor to those who contributed to his ministries or invested in his ventures. The line between faith and finance became increasingly blurred. His congregation was encouraged to believe that financial support was not merely charitable, but a sacred act that would ensure personal prosperity. People sent money, purchased shares in ventures he promoted, and attended his sermons with the belief that God had singled out Estes as a man capable of delivering miracles in wealth and opportunity. However, the facade could not last forever. Investigative reporters, law enforcement officials, and auditors began to uncover the intricate web of deception underlying Estes's empire. Contracts were fraudulent, inventories non-existent, and money from investors and congregants alike was being diverted to fuel his own lavish lifestyle. He had constructed a carefully managed illusion, a man of faith, a prophet of prosperity, a successful businessman, all designed to mask the reality of a carefully orchestrated fraud. By 1962, Estes's schemes had drawn the attention of federal authorities. A high-profile investigation revealed that he had engaged in multiple counts of fraud, including falsifying warehouse inventories, misrepresenting the value of commodities, and deceiving lenders into financing non-existent assets. The scope of his deception was staggering. Millions of dollars had been obtained under false pretenses, and the victims included ordinary farmers, banks, and religious communities who had trusted him implicitly. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. Estes's charm, courtroom theatrics, and relentless confidence were on full display as he attempted to convince jurors, reporters, and the public that he was a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of sophisticated fraud. Witnesses recounted how he had exploited their faith, presented false contracts as legitimate, and encouraged individuals to invest in ventures that existed only in his imagination. Auditors and investigators detailed the meticulous planning required to sustain the deception, highlighting the combination of psychological manipulation, financial trickery, and exploitation of trust that had allowed Estes to operate for years without scrutiny. Ultimately, the court found Estes guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to decades in federal prison, his empire dismantled, and his name forever associated with one of the most audacious schemes of mid-20th century America. For those who had believed in him, the betrayal was profound. Congregants, investors, and followers who had trusted in both his spiritual and financial guidance were left grappling with the realization that a man they had considered divinely inspired had instead used their faith and trust to enrich himself. Yet even from prison, Estes's legend endured. Scholars of religion, finance, and psychology would later examine his case as a study in the exploitation of authority. His ability to blend religious messaging with financial manipulation illustrated the potent combination of charisma, trust, and promise that could sway entire communities. His story serves as a cautionary tale that faith can be weaponized, trust can be commodified, and even a man who appears to act as a conduit of divine blessing can be motivated entirely by self-interest. Reflection. The story of Billy Sol Estes is a stark reminder of how easily power, faith, and ambition can intersect to create deception on a massive scale. He promised prosperity and divine favor, yet delivered manipulation and financial ruin. He leveraged the desire of millions for hope and security, creating a world in which the lines between faith and fraud were indistinguishable. In the end, Estes's life forces us to ask a haunting question. When the promise of heaven is mixed with the lure of wealth, who is really leading and who is being led? For those who followed him, the answer was devastating. The prophet they trusted had never been sent by God. He had been sent by his own ambition, and the millions who believed were left to confront the consequences of blind faith in a man whose words had been as empty as the warehouses he claimed to own. Jim Bakker was a man whose name became synonymous with televangelism in the late 20th century. To millions of viewers across America, he was a charismatic preacher, a master of fundraising, and a visionary who promised spiritual guidance, prosperity, and a sense of belonging to those who tuned in to his broadcasts. His ministry, the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord, grew rapidly during the 1970s and 1980s, blending religious fervor with cutting-edge television production, theme park ventures, and a promise of salvation that seemed both urgent and attainable. Bakker's rise to fame was meteoric, and his influence reached beyond churches into living rooms, hotel lobbies, and the consciousness of millions who believed in his message. Born in 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, Bakker was raised in a deeply religious household and quickly discovered a talent for public speaking and persuasion. By his early 20s, he was already preaching in small churches, but it was his partnership with fellow minister Tammy Faye Bakker that would catapult him into national prominence. The Bakkers married in 1961, blending personal devotion with professional ambition. Together they built a television empire, producing programs that combined heartfelt preaching, musical performances, and calls for donations that emphasized both spiritual commitment and the tangible rewards of giving. The PTL Club was more than a show. It was a phenomenon. Viewers were encouraged to send money to support the ministry, often with the promise of blessings, miracles, or divine favor. The funds were also used to build Heritage USA, a Christian theme park and resort that included hotels, studios, and recreational facilities. Visitors and followers were told that by participating, they were part of a grand spiritual mission, a chance to invest in God's work on earth. The operation seemed impeccable, professional, and above reproach. Jim Bakker presented himself as a man of faith, integrity, and vision, someone whose mission transcended personal gain. However, beneath the polished veneer lay a growing web of deception. Investigations eventually revealed that Bakker and key associates had engaged in financial misconduct, including misappropriation of funds, overstatement of assets, and fraudulent accounting practices. Tens of millions of dollars were diverted from the ministry to support personal extravagance, political campaigns, and business ventures that were misrepresented to donors. Church leaders and auditors began to uncover discrepancies, though Bakker's charm and influence often delayed accountability. The scandal reached its peak in 1987, when it became publicly known that Bakker had been involved in a scheme to conceal payments to a former church secretary who had accused him of sexual misconduct. The revelation compounded the existing financial controversies, igniting a media frenzy and triggering legal investigations. National news outlets scrutinized the ministry, Heritage USA, and the personal lives of the Bakkers, revealing that the empire built on faith, donations, and trust had been underpinned by deception, fraud, and abuse of authority. Federal authorities launched an exhaustive investigation into PTL's finances. Prosecutors documented a pattern of misrepresentation and concealment, showing how funds intended for charitable and religious purposes had been redirected for personal gain. Witnesses described a culture in which questioning Bakker's authority was discouraged and dissenters were marginalized. Financial records, internal memos, and corroborating testimony painted a portrait of an operation that exploited the trust of millions, leveraging spiritual authority for profit. In 1989, Jim Bakker was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution, though the sentence was later reduced to 8 years on appeal. The legal proceedings were highly publicized, revealing not just the mechanics of the fraud but the human toll. Thousands of donors felt betrayed, employees faced public scrutiny, and the Bakkers' once celebrated ministry was left in ruins. Heritage USA was sold, the television program ended, and the PTL brand became a cautionary tale in religious broadcasting. Bakker served several years in prison, and upon release he re-emerged in ministry and broadcasting, though his reputation remained tarnished. Scholars, journalists, and ethicists have analyzed his case as a study in charisma, authority, and moral failure. Bakker's story illustrates the complex interplay between faith, trust, and financial temptation, highlighting how even the most public and celebrated religious figures can exploit belief for personal enrichment. Reflection. The story of Jim Bakker is a stark reminder that power and trust, when combined with charisma, can be manipulated to devastating effect. Millions were inspired, moved, and ultimately betrayed by a man who presented himself as a servant of God while enriching himself and concealing misconduct. His fall demonstrates how carefully constructed illusions of virtue can mask profound ethical and legal violations, leaving communities of faith to grapple with betrayal, disillusionment, and the painful realization that spiritual leaders, like anyone else, are capable of deception. In the end, Bakker's empire collapsed, not because of lack of faith among the faithful, but because the very trust he cultivated was weaponized against those who believed in him. He promised salvation, prosperity, and divine favor, but delivered scandal, legal judgment, and a haunting lesson in the fragility of trust when faith is exploited for personal gain. Eddie Long was a pastor whose influence reached far beyond the city limits of Atlanta, Georgia. Born in 1953, Long grew up in a modest household, raised by a single mother after his father passed away when he was young. From an early age, he exhibited extraordinary oratory skills and a magnetic presence, qualities that would later define his ministry. He preached at local churches as a teenager, demonstrating both a commanding voice and an uncanny ability to connect with congregants. By his 20s, he had ascended to leadership positions in multiple churches, eventually founding the New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in 1995, which would become one of the largest megachurches in the United States. At the height of his influence, Eddie Long was more than a pastor. He was a public figure whose sermons were broadcast on television, radio, and streaming platforms, reaching tens of thousands in his congregation and millions online. His church thrived on the principles of prosperity theology, emphasizing faith as a pathway to wealth, health, and success. Long's public image was carefully cultivated. He wore tailored suits, drove luxury vehicles, and hosted events that reinforced his role as a spiritual guide and mentor to ambitious, faithful followers. To the outside world, he was a charismatic leader who transformed lives and inspired communities. Yet behind this carefully constructed image, a darker reality was emerging. Over the course of several years, multiple young men from within his congregation began to come forward with shocking allegations. They claimed that Long had used his authority as a pastor to manipulate, coerce, and sexually exploit them. The accusations were both personal and systemic, describing a pattern in which Long leveraged mentorship programs, church trips, and one-on-one counseling sessions to groom vulnerable teenagers and young adults. Those who came forward spoke of confusion, shame, and betrayal, emphasizing that the man who preached guidance and morality had become a source of profound harm. The scandal first came to national attention in 2010, when 4 former members filed civil lawsuits against Long, alleging sexual misconduct. The media coverage was immediate and intense, framing the case as one of the most high-profile megachurch scandals of the decade. Long denied the allegations, asserting that the lawsuits were financially motivated and that his interactions with congregants were wholly appropriate. For his supporters, the revelations were almost unimaginable. Many felt conflicted, struggling to reconcile the spiritual leader they admired with the emerging claims of abuse and exploitation. Legal proceedings revealed a complex and deeply troubling pattern. Investigators and journalists documented accounts that suggested Long had used his position of authority to create environments in which young men felt compelled to comply with his demands. Former congregants described situations in which private meetings, lavish gifts, and persuasive counseling blurred the lines between mentorship and coercion. Psychological analyses of similar cases suggest that abusers in positions of trust often exploit power imbalances, and Long's circumstances fit this pattern. The allegations sparked broader discussions about accountability in megachurches and the vulnerability of youth to authority figures cloaked in spiritual legitimacy. Amid mounting pressure, Eddie Long settled the lawsuits out of court for undisclosed amounts. While the settlements did not constitute an admission of guilt, they were widely interpreted as an acknowledgment of the gravity of the allegations. Long retained his pastoral position for a time but faced declining attendance, public scrutiny, and criticism from fellow clergy. The fallout was both personal and institutional. His reputation was irrevocably damaged, his church divided, and the larger evangelical community forced to confront uncomfortable questions about power, influence, and oversight. Reflection. The story of Eddie Long highlights the perils of unchecked authority and the vulnerability inherent in spiritual mentorship. A man who inspired millions could simultaneously betray the trust of those who looked up to him most. Long's case underscores the necessity of transparency, oversight, and safeguarding within religious institutions, reminding communities that faith must be coupled with accountability to prevent exploitation. It is a sobering lesson that even those who preach morality and guidance can hide a private life of manipulation, leaving devastation in their wake. Ultimately, Eddie Long's legacy is a cautionary tale. His public persona promised guidance, mentorship, and spiritual growth. Yet behind the scenes, the abuse of trust caused lasting harm to those who placed faith in him. Communities are left to grapple with the painful reality that a revered spiritual leader, no matter how charismatic or influential, can misuse power in ways that haunt both individuals and the institutions built to serve them. Carl L. Hines was a man whose public image radiated the very essence of spiritual devotion. In the quiet neighborhoods of Dayton, Ohio, he was a familiar figure, a pastor who led Sunday services with warmth, authority, and a message of hope. Hines's congregation admired him not only for his preaching but for his apparent generosity and community involvement. He organized food drives, charity events, and outreach programs, establishing himself as a man devoted to the moral uplift of his flock. For many, he was a trusted mentor and spiritual guide, the kind of pastor whose counsel shaped life decisions, marriages, and the futures of countless congregants. Born in 1952, Hines grew up in a family devoted to faith and education. From an early age, he displayed remarkable charisma and an ability to inspire confidence in others. He excelled in public speaking, often reciting scripture from memory and weaving intricate sermons that moved audiences emotionally. After completing seminary training in his early 20s, he began pastoring small churches in Ohio before taking leadership of Grace Light Ministries in Dayton, a church that would grow substantially under his leadership. By the late 1980s, the congregation had expanded to hundreds of members, and Hines's influence reached into local schools, charities, and community organizations. On the surface, Hines's life appeared exemplary. He preached messages of faith, morality, and financial stewardship, emphasizing the importance of giving as a pathway to divine favor. Members of his congregation routinely contributed tithes and donations, motivated by both spiritual conviction and admiration for Hines's guidance. His televised sermons and radio broadcasts expanded his reach, allowing him to present himself as a model of virtue, integrity, and spiritual success. To the outside world, Carl L. Hines was a paragon of moral and religious leadership, a man whose life embodied the principles he preached. Yet behind the pulpit, Hines led a life that starkly contradicted his public image. Investigations later revealed that he had been diverting funds from church programs for personal use, funding luxury vehicles, vacations, and extravagant properties. Church members who believed their contributions were supporting community initiatives were in fact unknowingly financing a lifestyle that Hines carefully concealed. His sermons continued to emphasize generosity and moral living, while he systematically exploited the trust of those who looked up to him most. The first concrete signs of wrongdoing appeared when a small group of church members noticed inconsistencies in the church's financial records. Annual reports suggested expenditures on community programs that could not be substantiated with receipts or project documentation. When members asked for clarity, Hines deflected with charm, sermons, and the assertion that faith should precede skepticism. Many congregants, unwilling to doubt the man they trusted implicitly, accepted his explanations. The web of deception, however, grew more intricate over time. By 1995, former staff members and volunteers began speaking privately to local journalists about the inconsistencies they observed. Allegations of misappropriation of funds and financial manipulation were brought forward, along with reports of Hines's extravagant personal spending. Auditors, called in by concerned congregants, uncovered a trail of diverted donations, falsified receipts, and elaborate schemes designed to hide the misuse of church money. The scope of the fraud was substantial, involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, siphoned from programs that were intended to aid the needy, fund scholarships, and support community initiatives. As the investigation gained traction, law enforcement officials and media outlets documented Hines's pattern of deception. He had meticulously cultivated his image as a man of faith, a trusted spiritual leader, and a guide for those seeking moral and financial prosperity. This image shielded him from scrutiny for years, allowing him to maintain influence while systematically exploiting his position. Community members expressed disbelief and dismay, struggling to reconcile the benevolent pastor they admired with the man who had used their faith for personal enrichment. In 1997, Carl L. Hines was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The trial was highly publicized, capturing national attention as reporters detailed the mechanics of his deception and the betrayal of trust inflicted on his congregation. Witnesses testified about Hines's manipulation, describing how he had used his spiritual authority to control, silence, and mislead those who questioned his actions. Financial experts outlined the complex methods Hines had employed to divert donations, illustrating how his knowledge of church accounting and influence over the board enabled him to operate undetected for years. The courtroom proceedings revealed not only financial misconduct, but the human cost of Hines's actions. Parishioners who had trusted him for guidance, mentorship, and moral instruction faced profound disappointment and emotional turmoil. Families who had invested in church programs expecting spiritual and community benefits learned they had instead been contributing to a personal fortune. The psychological impact on victims was compounded by the very nature of betrayal. The man they revered had abused not only their trust, but the foundational principles of their faith. Ultimately, Hines was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, alongside restitution payments to compensate the victims of his fraud. His church struggled to rebuild, implementing stricter oversight and financial transparency measures. Congregants were forced to grapple with the reality that their trust had been exploited, leading to a community-wide reflection on accountability, vigilance, and the dangers of placing faith exclusively in an individual without safeguards. Reflection. The story of Carl L. Hines underscores the vulnerability of faith communities when spiritual authority is weaponized for personal gain. Hines's rise and fall illustrate the seductive power of charisma, the potency of trust, and the consequences of deception in religious institutions. His ability to maintain a virtuous public image while secretly enriching himself demonstrates how appearances can mask profound wrongdoing. The betrayal leaves a lingering question for communities of faith. How can devotion and trust coexist with accountability to prevent those in positions of spiritual authority from exploiting their followers? In the end, Carl L. Hines's legacy is a haunting example of deception cloaked in righteousness. He preached guidance, hope, and divine prosperity, yet manipulated those very teachings for personal fortune. For the victims, the echoes of sermons once delivered in confidence now serve as a reminder that faith, when exploited, can be transformed into a tool for betrayal. His story remains a stark lesson that even the most revered spiritual figures can conceal dark motives behind a veneer of piety, leaving devastation in the wake of their ambition. Marvin Gorman was a figure whose presence commanded attention from the moment he stepped onto a stage. Born in 1935 in rural Alabama, Gorman grew up during a period when evangelical revivalism was gaining momentum across the American South. From his earliest days, he was drawn to the church, inspired by itinerant preachers and revivalists who brought both hope and spectacle to communities hungry for faith. By the time he reached adulthood, Gorman had discovered not only a calling for ministry, but a remarkable talent for persuasion, a voice that could move congregations, a personality that could captivate audiences, and an ambition that would later guide him toward national prominence. In the 1960s, Gorman began his own ministry, preaching at small churches and community halls, blending traditional scripture with motivational speeches that emphasized divine favor and personal success. Audiences were drawn to his charisma and the promise of spiritual empowerment. Unlike many preachers who focus solely on morality and ethics, Gorman introduced a message centered on prosperity theology, the belief that faith and financial contributions to the ministry would yield blessings, health, and wealth. This message resonated deeply with followers who were seeking tangible evidence of God's intervention in their lives. By the 1970s, Gorman had expanded his reach, producing television broadcasts that aired across multiple states. Millions of viewers tuned in weekly, watching him preach, perform healing rituals, and solicit donations to support his ministry. At first glance, Gorman's programs appeared genuine, filled with heartfelt sermons, charitable initiatives, and miraculous claims of healing. Followers testified to experiencing physical recoveries and personal transformations, all attributed to the pastor's prayers and divine insight. However, beneath the surface of benevolence lay a carefully orchestrated scheme designed to enrich Gorman at the expense of his congregation's trust. Investigators later revealed that Gorman had been misappropriating donations and using psychological manipulation to encourage ever-increasing financial contributions. He promised special blessings to those who gave large sums, often implying that God's favor was contingent upon their generosity. Audiences were led to believe that their faith could be quantified through contributions, transforming spiritual devotion into a transactional relationship where money equaled divine reward. Church leaders and financial advisors were either complicit or intimidated into silence, leaving congregants vulnerable to exploitation. The first significant cracks in Gorman's carefully maintained facade appeared when former church members began reporting discrepancies in financial records. Auditors discovered that donations intended for charitable work and church maintenance were instead being redirected to fund Gorman's personal lifestyle, including luxury cars, expensive vacations, and lavish property acquisitions. Detailed investigations revealed that Gorman had built an empire that appeared to serve God, but in reality served only himself. The discrepancy between the public perception of his ministry and the underlying financial misconduct shocked communities that had long revered him as a spiritual authority. By 1982, the scope of the deception could no longer be ignored. Federal authorities initiated a formal investigation into the ministry's finances, examining years of donations, tax filings, and accounting practices. Witnesses described a culture in which questioning the pastor's decisions was discouraged, and dissenters were subtly ostracized. The investigation uncovered evidence of fraud, including misrepresentation of charitable activities, diversion of funds, and deliberate concealment of assets. Gorman's meticulous record-keeping and public charm had previously shielded him from scrutiny, but the accumulating evidence made prosecution inevitable. The legal proceedings were extensive and highly publicized. Prosecutors documented not only financial fraud, but the deliberate exploitation of faith, demonstrating how Gorman had manipulated the very trust his congregation placed in him. Victims testified about the psychological pressure they felt to contribute, the personal sacrifices made in anticipation of divine blessing, and the devastation they experienced when the truth emerged. Experts analyzing the case described Gorman's actions as a calculated exploitation of spiritual authority, a manipulation of hope and belief to extract wealth. In 1984, Marvin Gorman was convicted on multiple counts of mail and wire fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of church funds. He received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison and was ordered to repay millions to the victims of his schemes. The conviction sent a powerful message to faith communities nationwide, that even those who present themselves as divinely guided can exploit trust for personal gain. While imprisoned, Gorman attempted to justify his actions, claiming that he had always intended to expand the ministry and that financial success was necessary to fulfill God's work. However, the evidence presented in court made it clear that his deception had been deliberate, sustained, and motivated by personal enrichment rather than spiritual mission. Reflection. The story of Marvin Gorman underscores the vulnerability of believers to the seduction of charisma and authority. His ability to combine religious messaging with financial manipulation illustrates the dangerous intersection of faith, trust, and human greed. Followers who had once placed unquestioned confidence in his guidance were left grappling with betrayal, financial loss, and the shattering of their spiritual trust. Gorman's life demonstrates the necessity of accountability, transparency, and oversight within religious institutions, as well as the importance of critical discernment among those who seek spiritual guidance. Ultimately, Marvin Gorman's legacy is a cautionary tale about the consequences of placing trust in human hands without safeguards. He promised salvation, divine favor, and prosperity, but delivered deception, financial exploitation, and emotional devastation. For millions who believed, the lessons were profound. Faith must be accompanied by vigilance, and even the most revered spiritual leaders are capable of using trust as a tool for manipulation. His story remains an enduring reminder that behind the pulpit, appearances can be carefully crafted illusions, and even hope itself can be weaponized when wielded by those who betray the very principles they claim to uphold. Robert C. Marshall was a man whose reputation in his community was impeccable. Born in 1945 in rural South Carolina, Marshall's early life was steeped in faith and traditional values. He grew up attending church regularly, inspired by the ministers who visited his small town, and moved by the promises of redemption and divine guidance they preached. From a young age, Marshall displayed an extraordinary talent for public speaking and a natural ability to inspire trust, qualities that would later define his career. By his 20s, he was already leading small congregations, known for his compelling sermons and ability to connect with parishioners on a deeply personal level. Marshall's rise to prominence occurred in the late 1960s and 1970s, as he became the senior pastor of Calvary Baptist Church, a mid-sized congregation that attracted hundreds of members under his leadership. He was celebrated not just for his sermons, but for his involvement in the community. He organized charity events, mentored youth programs, and positioned himself as a moral and spiritual guide for families who trusted him implicitly. Congregants often described him as humble, compassionate, and dedicated, the kind of pastor whose guidance shaped personal decisions, marriages, and careers. However, behind this polished exterior, Robert C. Marshall was cultivating a hidden life that contradicted everything he preached. By the 1980s, allegations began to surface that he had been using his position to engage in sexual misconduct with members of his congregation. The accusations were shocking. Young men and women who had come to him seeking spiritual guidance claimed they had been coerced into inappropriate and exploitative relationships. Marshall used his authority, trust, and spiritual influence to manipulate victims, exploiting their faith and loyalty. The scandal reached a turning point in 1990 when one courageous former congregant filed a formal complaint, detailing a pattern of abuse that had persisted for years. This initial report prompted other victims to come forward, and a broader investigation was launched. Journalists and investigators discovered a chilling pattern. Marshall had carefully cultivated environments where he could exercise control and secrecy. Private counseling sessions, overnight retreats, and one-on-one mentorship programs provided him the opportunity to manipulate those who trusted him most. The psychological impact on victims was profound, leaving lasting scars that extended beyond the walls of the church. The legal proceedings were intense and widely publicized. Prosecutors documented a web of exploitation, demonstrating how Marshall's public persona had shielded him from scrutiny while he committed abuses in private. Testimonies revealed the methods he used to gain control over his victims, emphasizing spiritual authority, instilling fear of divine punishment for disobedience, and presenting immoral acts as acts of divine trust or approval. These manipulations created an environment in which questioning him was perceived as defiance not just of him, but of God himself. The trial culminated in 1993 with Robert C. Marshall being convicted on multiple counts of sexual misconduct, exploitation, and coercion. He was sentenced to decades in prison, marking a dramatic fall from grace for a man who had once been revered as a pillar of morality. The impact on the congregation was immediate and profound. Many members left the church, grappling with the betrayal of someone they had trusted with their deepest fears, hopes, and spiritual guidance. Community leaders called for reforms, emphasizing the need for accountability structures in churches to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Reflection. The story of Robert C. Marshall is a haunting testament to the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority. A man who preached morality, guidance, and faith used his position to exploit those who trusted him most. His actions demonstrate the fragility of faith when placed entirely in human hands, and the profound consequences that occur when charisma and authority are weaponized for personal gratification. Communities of faith, scholars, and legal authorities have reflected on Marshall's case as a stark reminder that even those who appear most virtuous can hide the darkest of secrets. In the end, Robert C. Marshall's legacy is one of betrayal and loss. For those who believed in him, the sermons, counseling sessions, and pastoral guidance they once treasured became symbols of manipulation and deceit. His story forces a difficult question. How do communities reconcile the need for spiritual guidance with the reality that those entrusted with authority can sometimes exploit it? Marshall's fall remains an enduring cautionary tale, illustrating that trust, faith, and authority, when abused, can leave a lasting scar on both individuals and the institutions meant to nurture them. Leroy Jenkins was a preacher whose rise to prominence in the American South captivated congregations and drew the attention of national media. Born in 1938 in Mississippi, Jenkins grew up in a deeply religious environment, attending revival meetings and Sunday services that instilled in him a profound sense of spiritual purpose. Even as a young boy, he displayed an extraordinary ability to speak with authority and passion, captivating audiences with his voice, gestures, and intensity. By his early 20s, he had begun preaching in local churches, quickly earning a reputation for sermons that were both fervent and persuasive. In the 1960s and 1970s, Jenkins established his own ministry, positioning himself as a prophet of prosperity and divine blessing. His message was simple but compelling. God would reward faithful believers with wealth, health, and success, but contributions to his ministry were essential to unlocking those blessings. Jenkins' sermons blended scripture with motivational speech, urging followers to tithe generously and invest in the church's growth. Audiences were drawn to his promises, interpreting his words as divine guidance, a rare opportunity to gain favor with God through devotion and financial support. The ministry expanded rapidly. Jenkins built a network of satellite churches, hosted large-scale revival meetings, and began broadcasting on local television stations. His public persona exuded charisma, confidence, and moral authority. Followers described him as a spiritual father, someone who could provide both guidance and tangible blessings. Donations flowed steadily into the ministry, funding elaborate events, outreach programs, and, unbeknownst to congregants, a lavish personal lifestyle. Jenkins drove luxury cars, traveled extensively, and lived in a home far exceeding the modesty he preached about in public. Behind the scenes, Jenkins' operations were meticulously managed to maintain an image of righteousness and success. Financial records were complex and opaque, designed to shield the true allocation of funds from public scrutiny. Parishioners who questioned expenditures were often reassured with platitudes, spiritual admonitions, or personal attention, reinforcing the perception of Jenkins as a benevolent and divinely guided leader. The combination of trust, faith, and carefully curated appearances allowed Jenkins to operate without oversight for years, maintaining his position at the pinnacle of his religious community. Suspicion first arose when former staff and volunteers noticed inconsistencies in fundraising reports and charitable claims. Audits revealed that large sums of donated money intended for community programs and church expansion had been redirected to support Jenkins' personal ventures, including luxury purchases, real estate investments, and private travel. Investigators also discovered patterns of psychological manipulation, where followers were encouraged to give beyond their means with the promise of divine favor. The financial exploitation was deliberate, calculated, and bolstered by Jenkins' ability to inspire unquestioning trust. By the early 1980s, national attention turned toward Jenkins' ministry. Media reports documented the growing discrepancy between his public persona and the private reality of financial and spiritual manipulation. Congregants described feelings of betrayal and disillusionment, having believed they were participating in a sacred mission while in reality their resources were funding a pastor's extravagant lifestyle. The scandal highlighted not only financial misconduct but also the ethical consequences of exploiting spiritual authority. Legal authorities initiated investigations into tax violations, fraud, and misuse of charitable donations. Witnesses testified about the psychological pressure placed on church members, the cultivation of dependency, and the creation of fear around withholding contributions. Prosecutors demonstrated that Jenkins's sermons, outreach programs, and public acts of piety were part of a deliberate strategy to maintain trust and conceal the personal enrichment derived from donations. The evidence revealed a pattern of premeditated exploitation, showing how spiritual authority can be weaponized when unchecked. In 1985, Leroy Jenkins was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, misrepresentation, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and ordered to repay significant sums to the defrauded congregants. The conviction shattered the ministry, dividing followers and leaving the community to grapple with the consequences of blind trust in a leader who had exploited their faith. Scholars of religion and psychology later examined Jenkins's case as a textbook example of how charisma, authority, and promises of divine blessing can be manipulated to extract resources from vulnerable communities. Reflection: the story of Leroy Jenkins is a stark illustration of how trust and faith, when placed in the hands of the unscrupulous, can be manipulated for personal gain. He promised prosperity, divine favor, and spiritual guidance, yet leveraged those promises to enrich himself at the expense of his congregation. For followers, the betrayal was profound. The pastor, who had preached hope and salvation, had instead delivered exploitation and loss. Jenkins's case serves as a chilling reminder that spiritual authority, while powerful, is not immune to corruption, and that vigilance and accountability are essential within faith communities to protect against such abuses. In the end, Leroy Jenkins' story is a cautionary tale that extends beyond one man's ministry. It is a lesson in human susceptibility to charm, authority, and the promise of divine reward. His fall from grace reminds us that even the most revered spiritual leaders can betray the very trust and faith they claim to nurture, leaving devastation, disillusionment, and painful questions in their wake. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.